So tonight we are talking about fear. Now, as a kid growing up, I think the biggest fear that I remember and the thing that sticks out to my mind as a child and what I was most afraid of has to be middle school. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, well, what part of middle school? To be honest with you, all parts, every bit of it. I distinctively remember that the night before I was to start middle school, I couldn't sleep. I was overcome with fear. I stayed up all night, bawled my eyes out. And to be honest, I can't even remember what specifically it was I was afraid of. I just remember hearing so many horror stories. I remember thinking, man, I'm such a small, scrawny little kid. Like, I'm going to get beat up. And I wasn't sure how to use a locker. Like, it just, everything about middle school freaked me out. And I was terrified of middle school. Now, we asked some of you guys on social media and across all of our platforms, what was some of the childhood fears that you had? And we got some great responses. Some common ones were afraid of the dark, afraid of snakes was a big one, afraid of thunderstorms. And so we had some big ones. We had some that were a little weird. We had afraid of pizza. I'm not sure how that's even humanly possible, but whatever. One of my favorites was a fear of sharks being in swimming pools. I don't get how that even originates. Like what happened to you as a kid that you think there are sharks in swimming pools? I'm not sure what's the deal with that, but nonetheless, there's some childhood fears that we all experienced. And as we grow older, some of these childhood fears, they're easy to kind of laugh off and write off, but that's because they've passed, right? We're grown up. We recognize that those are things that we don't have to be afraid of anymore. Now, some of it, yeah, as a kid, we're still afraid of it today. But for a lot of childhood fears that we're able to laugh about, like pizza and things like that, it's because we recognize now that they're not an issue. We're kind of grown past that. But what do you do with the fears that have stuck with you? Or what do you do with more kind of weighty fears? Fears like the fear of heartbreak or the fear of rejection. Maybe it's the fear of failure. What if it's a fear of being alone? You know, I did some research on what is the most common fear in today's world across all ages. And I was kind of shocked at what the results were. The most common fear right now in today's world is fear of the unknown, fear of the future. Now, that may have something to do with what's going on in our world today. It probably does. But it seems that the most common thing that people are afraid of is not snakes, it's not the dark, it's not pizza. It's fear of the unknown, fear of the future. Now, I'm going to say something that's going to challenge you. It's challenged me, definitely. And we're going to talk about this, but here's what I want to submit to you today. I want to submit to you that the area that you fear the most is the area that you trust God the least. I think the thing that I fear the most has got to be a fear of failure. Now, I'm very blessed and grateful to be at a place in life where I have areas of leadership. I lead a family. I've got a wife and kids, and I lead a ministry, and very grateful that I get to lead, student ministry. But with that comes a little bit of a weight of responsibility, right? There's a pressure there. And my biggest fear is failure, man. I don't want to let these people down. I don't ever want there to be a point where somebody would look at me and go, man, Aaron failed me. Aaron let me down. That's probably my biggest fear. And what that reveals to me is really a lack of trust in God and relying on my own abilities way more than I should. It's revealed to me and challenged me that, Aaron, listen, you rely way too much on your own understanding, your own ability to do things more than you do on God's. Like, Aaron, you've got to come to a point where you recognize that you can only do so much, that God is bigger than all of this, and God's ultimately got the final say. God's got all the understanding. He's got all the might and the power. And honestly, Aaron, you just need to be grateful that he's allowing you to be a part of this stuff, and God's using you and he's working through you, but it's not anything that you're doing. It's all what God is doing through you. And so for me, that's got to be the biggest struggle when I consider the fact that the area that I fear the most is the area that I trust God the least. And so we are talking about fear. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about change, and we were in Romans chapter 6. I got to reading in Romans and kind of continued reading on, and I found myself in Romans chapter 8. And there's a part here that I want to share with you. And what was really interesting to me about this is what you're going to see is Paul talks about identity, but within this talk of identity, he reveals something about fear. Now, let's see if you can pick up on it. Pay attention to where he mentions fear. So this is Romans chapter 8, verse 14. He says, "For those who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear, But the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, which means Father. This is so interesting to me. That Paul says you used to be a slave to self, a slave to sin, a slave to this world, but you were brought into sonship. You were adopted. And so you used to be, and the adjective that he uses is a fearful slave. You used to be a slave who lived by fear, but now he says you're a son. Now notice that. Notice how he relates fear as this identity issue. He's basically letting us know that, listen, a slave to self, a slave to this world, somebody whose only value comes from what they do, somebody who has no access to the master, they live a life driven by fear. A slave receives punishment and harshness, and they live a life driven by fear. But Paul says that when you were adopted and you became a son or daughter, when you became a child, fear did not come with you. When that transaction happened and you went from a slave to a son, fear did not transfer. That's one of the things that didn't come over in the custody battle for your soul. See, Paul, I think, would say that, listen, whereas a slave may receive, harshness and punishment, a child receives discipline and grace. And a slave is driven by fear because their only value comes from what they're able to do and how well they're able to perform. And they have no direct access to the Father, to the Master. But he says, all that has changed now. As a son, all of your value comes from the mark that God put on you. All of your value comes from who you are. It's your birthmark. It's your birthright. You have the Spirit of God living inside of you. And so a slave inherits nothing, but a child inherits everything. A slave is driven by fear and has no access to the master, but a child inherits everything and lives by power and lives by love and has direct access to the master. Paul talks about, if you continue to read on, he talks about inheritance. And he talks about how as a child of God, you inherit what Christ inherits. And one of the most amazing things that God has done for you and I as children, is he's given us this incredible, powerful gift of the Spirit. It's God's Spirit living inside of us. The same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead. And so before we were powerless, no value, no power on our own. But now as a son or daughter of Christ, fear is not a part of us. Power is a part of us. The Spirit now drives us, not fear. God's Spirit drives us. I love what he continues to say in verse 26, because you may find yourself in that place where you say, okay, Aaron, I get that. I'm a child of God. I have the Spirit of God, but I still get afraid sometimes. Then what do I do? In verse 26, he says, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. Did you see me get afraid? That is a ginormic bug. That is a ginormic bug. That is a ginormic bug. Verse 26, he says, in the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. Paul says that in those moments where you find yourself in weakness, when you find yourself afraid and things happen, you don't even have to know what to say. This incredible gift of the Spirit that God has given us, it intercedes for us. It speaks directly. That God the Spirit speaks directly to God the Father. I'll explain it like this. My kids, they sometimes still get afraid. Maybe it's in the middle of the night and they have a bad dream, or maybe they hear something, bump in the night. And fear hits them. They're struck with being afraid. But what do? They come running into Dad's room. I bring them close to my chest. I hold them. And oftentimes they don't even know how to describe their nightmare. They don't even know how to put into words. They're so shaken up. But I'm there to comfort them. They don't even have to speak to me. I know my children. And I know what they're going through. And so I comfort them. And so they don't have to live a life like this. Like, they don't have to stand outside and beg to come in. They have full access to the Father. They have every access to me that's available. Like, they have full access to me. And they have the power to come to me. Listen, as a child of God, when you're faced with fear, I want you to remember this. It's an identity issue. Okay, when fear seeps in and we get afraid, it's one thing to get startled. It's one thing to recognize, okay, and to use caution. But it's another thing to live by fear. A slave lives by fear because all they receive is punishment and harshness. But a child of God lives by power. A son or daughter of God lives by power because they receive discipline and grace and love and mercy from a loving Heavenly Father. And so just because we may get startled sometimes, just because things may happen in our lives, man, let's take a step back and remember, okay, when the enemy tries to remind me of my fear, I'm going to remind the enemy of who my Father is. I'm going to remind myself that, like, I'm in the house of God. Like, God is right here with me. I don't have to live as a fearful slave anymore. God has given me His Spirit, the powerful, godly Spirit inside of me, God, the Spirit that raised Christ from the dead. And so I just want to challenge you, okay? If you find yourself in that place, or maybe it's the fear of unknown, or the fear of rejection, or like me, the fear of failure, man, let's remind ourselves, let's put our soul back in check and go, listen, we've got to remember whose we belong to. Fear did not transition in the custody change. Fear did not come with us in the adoption. We are powerful sons and daughters of God. We have the Spirit of God living inside of us. And so when the enemy tries to remind me of my fear, for me, when the enemy tries to remind me of my fear of failure, I'm going to remind the enemy of who my Father is and how I already have victory in Christ. No matter what you're facing, remind your fear of who your Father is.